So, as I promised, starting off with a few slides that sort of they basically steal the infographics from Public Health England, actually. They've got some great infographics on their Health Matters website, and this one really illustrates quite nicely how when we think about air pollution, it's coming from multiple different sources, and we're also looking at a range of different pollutants from multiple different sources. So I could pick out a few key ones there, for instance, looking at road transport, where NOx and NO2, nitrogen dioxide, is a key pollutant, but then we also get NO2 in other areas here as well. Looking at industry, for instance, and particulate matter coming in from residential as well. So lots of different sources contributing lots of different pollutants to a big soup of pollutants, basically. And then there's lots of secondary reactions thereafter as well. And the impacts of air pollution, the reason why we're interested in air pollution is because it's a public health issue. And these, again, looking at Public Health England statistics, we now have ranged 28,000 to 36,000 premature deaths attributed to exposure to particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide combined. And here we're looking at impacts relating to heart disease and strokes, as well as asthma and lung cancer. And these impacts are felt short-term and long-term. So we have different effects, different health impacts, depending on whether or not people are exposed to high concentrations of pollutants over a short period of time, even an hour, or people are living alongside busy roads, for instance. They're living with long-term elevated levels of pollution, and they can lead to different effects. So short-term effects can lead to exacerbations of asthma, for instance, or even a heart attack. It can actually lead to a heart attack, whereas long-term effects potentially leading to stroke, cardiovascular diseases, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, for instance. So it has health effects, but it's more complicated than that because we have different health effects at different stages in our life course. So even before we're born, there's a chance that our mothers exposed to air pollution will lead to ultimately our low birth rate. And then growing up, we have developing lungs, developing cells, we have narrow airways, and the impacts of air pollution on our health will be different from when we become adults. It's important also to recognise that the health insults that children are faced with will be felt throughout their lives. So the stunted lung growth that they have as children will then have a knock-on effect. And so in adulthood, we will also be subject to the effects that we will have had from being exposed to air pollution over longer periods of time, the chronic exposure that we talked about before, the chronic effects. And then when we get to old age, obviously we have that long period that we've been exposed, the build-up of different diseases, and here we're looking perhaps at lung cancer and diabetes and dementia. So there is emerging evidence all the time that air pollution is contributing to different health effects and ultimately premature death. So we've said that there are key vulnerable groups. We recognise children as a key vulnerable group and older people and also pregnant women. But there are also people that have existing cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. They are also particularly susceptible. And there are communities that are living in areas with poor air quality. And it tends to be those areas with poor air quality also tend to be areas with very high levels of deprivation. So I'm moving into the area of our research now. And this is some work that was undertaken by a PhD student of ours, Hugh Brunt, who works for Public Health Wales. And he looked at this relationship between air pollution, deprivation and health, and identified that not only do you have high levels of air pollution associated with high levels of deprivation, actually you have a multiplicative effect. So where you have those areas that are highly polluted and highly deprived, the health impacts are actually more than you would expect from each of those individually combined. Further research, which I undertook with a colleague of mine, Tim Chatterton, looked at the MOT records. So this graph that you can see here is really just looking at nitrogen dioxide concentrations from DEFRA data against households in poverty. So the further along the x-axis you go, the more households in poverty in those areas. And you can quite clearly see that in areas with high percentages of households, high proportions of households in poverty, you have much higher concentrations of nitrogen dioxide in this case. So there's a clear linear relationship there between poverty and exposure to in this case, road traffic pollution. And then if you bring in this slide here, so The one on the left is the original slide that you've already seen. The one on the right now is using the MOT records. And here we looked at the emissions that are being generated per household from private vehicles. And you can see it's the inverse of the previous graph. So those households or those areas with a high proportion of households in poverty are not the ones that are generating the pollution, essentially, not from private vehicles. So we have a real environmental justice, a real social inequity issue here. We tend to think that it's the poorer households, they have the older vehicles potentially, that are causing the pollution to which they are then subject. But actually our evidence is showing it's the more affluent households that are generating the pollution that the poor then are forced to suffer. And this piece of work, this report you can see here on this slide, is a report from the European Environment Agency that came out earlier this month, which is actually expanding on that a little bit more. So we did a piece of work, you can see the link at the bottom there, which was looking at a review of evidence, the latest evidence relating to noise, air pollution and socioeconomic status. So bringing in noise to the equation as well. And what the Environment Agency, European Environment Agency, has also done is look at the impacts of heat as well, thinking about climate change and the increase of the urban heat island effect. Actually, all these multiple urban stressors are going to be having multiple impacts on people's lives. So it's not just about thinking about things in isolation, it's about thinking about these combined urban stressors when we're living in cities. And they demonstrate that in this sort of infographic here as well, where you can see, particularly in urban areas, it's that build-up, that combination of low socioeconomic status, high levels of air pollution, high levels of noise, and high levels of heat stress as well, that are having a combined health impact. So my message is that we need to be thinking about these things holistically, and we need to be thinking about them in terms of public health as well. So that's me.